21 of A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by George Yeager. Book 1, Part 3, Section 6 of the Inference from the Impression to the Idea. It is easy to observe that in tracing this relation, the inference we draw from cause to effect is not derived merely from a survey of these particular objects and from such a penetration into their essences as may discover the dependence of the one upon the other. There is no object which implies the existence of any other if we consider these objects in themselves and never look beyond the ideas which we form of them. Such an inference would amount to knowledge and would imply the absolute contradiction and impossibility of conceiving anything different. But as all distinct ideas are separable, it is evident there can be no impossibility of that kind. When we pass from a present impression to the idea of any object, we might possibly have separated the idea from the impression and have substituted any other idea in its room. It is therefore by experience only that we can infer the existence of one object from that of another.
I have a sense that he's, using a lot more terms that he needs to, and there's overlapping ideas of what is experience compared to impression. These objects he's talking about, are they the same as the ideas? So it's a little confusing, to be honest, and this is one of the trademark critique point I usually have when I deconstruct other people's philosophy, that they throw around terms that are sometimes given in a definition of some kind or an understanding, and then they are sort of dropped and new terms are used that are not defined maybe, or the old terms are used in new ways, or new terms are used instead of old terms, or whatever, right? I like a philosophy to build slowly from the ground up and not using terms that not already has clear understanding based on something that came prior to it in the philosophy. I don't think that it is sufficiently coherent by Hume at this point, but then I'll understand experience in my way of understanding experience, which is something going on in the mind, right? I have an experience. Or maybe I'll have to adjust it according to how he keeps explaining things further down the line here, right? But it's just a little annoying to me, to be honest, that he is throwing around terms without clarification to at least some extent, and that is not a good and functional philosophy, in my opinion.
The nature of experience is this. We remember to have had frequent instances of the existence of one species of objects, and also remember that the
So now it's a species of object rather than a species of idea, for instance. And what is a species, right? That's usually used for animals, right? So the meaning of the terms compared to prior similar kind of references with other terms, does that mean you're using the same another term for the same thing, or the same or for a different thing, right? So it's kind of annoying, right? But it is, remember it's 300 years old, right? Almost. So it's not like it's something in today's world, in today's philosophy, it should be more strict, right? There has run a lot of water under the bridge since 1739, right? But still, I would like it. I mean, I'm coming from 2023 in the 21st century, right? And this is my approach to philosophy, and I will, of course, comment on that no matter who the philosopher is, whether or not I like the general philosophy or not, right?
individuals of another species of objects have always attended them and have existed in a regular order of contiguity and succession with regard to them. Thus, we remember to have seen that species of object we call flame, and to have felt that species of sensation we call heat. We likewise call to mind their constant conjunction in all past instances. Without any farther ceremony, we call the one cause and the other effect, and infer the existence of the one from that of the other. In all those instances from which we learn the conjunction of particular causes and effects, both the causes and effects have been perceived by the senses and are remembered. But in all cases wherein we reason concerning them, there is only one perceived or remembered, and the other is supplied in conformity to our past experience. Thus, in advancing, we have insensibly discovered a new relation betwixt cause and effect, when we least expected it, and were entirely employed upon another subject. This relation is their constant conjunction. Contiguity and succession are not sufficient to make us pronounce any two objects to be cause and effect, unless we perceive that these two relations are preserved in several instances. We may now see the advantage of quitting the direct survey of this relation in order to discover the nature of that necessary connection which makes so essential a part of it. There are hopes that by this means we may at last arrive at our proposed end, though to tell the truth, this new discovered relation of a constant conjunction seems to advance us but very little in our way. For it implies no more than this, that like objects have always been placed in like relations of contiguity and succession, and it seems evident, at least at first sight, that by this means we can never discover any new idea and can only multiply, but not enlarge, the objects of our mind. It may be thought
It's very, very polemic, or maybe polemic is not the right term. I don't think it is, but it's very wordy. It's very long-winded. I feel like he's not getting to the point, but it may just be the impenetrable, situation of the language, according to my abilities here, right? But I feel like he's trying to find all sorts of arguments in directions of reductio ad absurdum, or things that needs to have something, then at the same time they are of a different kind, so they can't have that, and still also keeping in mind that it has to be experienced in order to be, it has to be an experience, or it has to be impressed somehow in order to be an object. And the object, I'm confused about whether or not he think of that as an idea or what, right? So it's confusing to me, this chapter here, and it has been going on for a while now. This is the third or fourth video I'm doing on causation. So I am a little baffled, to be honest, why he takes so long time on this, right? Apparently it is, I guess it's because of the Newtonian angle of his philosophy, that he really needs to hammer this home in order to get somewhere. I will stick to the presentation I made in the, not the last, but the third, one of the prior recent videos, where I presented my idea of causation. I don't think it's too complicated. It's just expectations of what might happen from a given situation based on prior memories, right? So it's a slightly more complicated than that, but it's not much more complicated, right? And he falls for the trap of having to somehow argue for something. But if it's not something that is a part of ideas or impressions, it will be hard to argue other than saying it's not a part of it. And therefore you can't get it that way that you think you can get it, right? Everything that you have access to is something that goes on in you, right? It's kind of comes with it, right? If it's not a part of you, then it's not your experience, right? And if you don't have the experience, you don't have it. It's not available. You're not aware of it. You can't be aware of it, right? So if it's something you have access to of some kind, it must be a part of you. And if you're talking about an external world having some kind of connections and causalities and objects that are representations of something going on out there, you can't get to it anyway, right? You can only say, I have something going on in my mind and I have these ideas of this, that, and the other. How do I approach this, right? And it's a subjective task. It's your philosophy. You have to do it yourself. I can only inspire you, try to help you avoid stupid mistakes or fallacies or bad logic, bad reasoning, or try to reason where you cannot reason, use some axioms and so on instead, right? That's all I can do. I can't tell you what to think, or how to approach your thinking, or how to approach your experience, right? And all of it is in you, your experience, right? If it's anything like how I work, right? And this is sort of an axiom. I'm saying, if I work this way, I will say to you, you probably work that way also, without having access to your experience of me telling you this, if you're experiencing it, right? So you can almost go crazy in these kinds of loops. But at the end of the day, everything you have access to is going on in you. That means if you have something you refer to as causation, it's a part of your experience, right? One way or another. At least it's some idea you have, or maybe not in a Humean way, but a notion you have, to be as neutral in a term as possible, right? You have a notion of causality. Well, that notion is a part of you, right? Nobody can tell you. You should not accept anybody telling you, you should understand it as this, right? It has to be like this. It must be like you're stupid if you do it differently, right? It's this appeal to, I have come up with the answers for the human race, right? It doesn't work. At the end of the day, you have to decide what to do with your experiences, right? And I would encourage you to think about it, because that's, and I might mention that I got a few new subs here in the last couple of days, and welcome aboard. Thank you for joining the show. I hope you, I would think that it's because of this deconstruction I'm doing of Hume that you might have found some interest in what I might have be able to do in the future and have done in the past. And please go check out my channel and find some old videos that might be of your taste. But let's get back to the video.
That what we learn not from one object, we can never learn from 100, which are all of the same kind and are perfectly resembling in every circumstance. As our senses shew us in one instance two bodies or motions or qualities in certain relations of success and contiguity, so our memory presents us only with a multitude of...
Careful, Hume, right? A motion is not a part of your impression, right? So it's like, as our senses shew us an instance of two bodies or motions, a motion is not something that you sense, right? You sense something that is presented on your perception. And that's now talking sensory stuff, right? But the motion is your description of the interpretation of how it changes, right? So the motion is your labeling, you're creating a pattern or something like that you somehow attach to that experience from the inside, so to say, right? So it's not the senses that throw us emotion. Emotion is a way to label our understanding of what is going on, right? So, and this is probably one of the most difficult ones to to one way you can see it is an elephant has a color or a sound and or a taste and or a smell and so on, right? Emotion, what sound does it have? What taste does it have? What color does it have? It has none of these, right? So it's some kind of next level derivative of these things that you're pointing to, participating in this motion, as you call it, right? So the motion itself must be a next level derivative from these objects that are themselves having these sensations. So the motion cannot be a sensation, right? That's one way of seeing it.
Instances wherein we always find like bodies, motions, or qualities in like relations. From the mere repetition of any past impression, even to infinity, there never will arise any new original idea, such as that of a necessary connection. And the number of impressions has in this case no more effect than if we confine ourselves to one only. But though this reasoning seems just and obvious, yet as it would be folly to despair too soon, we shall continue the thread of our discourse. And having found that after the discovery of the constant conjunction of any objects, we always draw an inference from one object to another, we shall now examine the nature of that inference and of the transition from the impression to the idea. Perhaps it will appear in the end that the necessary connection depends on the inference instead of the inferences depending on the necessary connection.
So the inference is something that comes from the inside of the subject, a human being. So it's an inference, it's something, it's a story, let's put it that way, that we add to the picture. It's a term for a description of a certain goings on, right? When you analyze your experiences, there are certain patterns and say, okay, that pattern could be useful or something like, I think I will call it causation, right? I mean, it isn't really much more complicated than that, right? It's like when you have to be reaching some kind of certainty, or some certainty, in my opinion, is a pipe dream in itself, right? It's impossible to be certain. You might qualify what you mean by certain, but certainty is something that can be known and can never change. Otherwise, it's not certain, is it? Right? Otherwise, it's just your particular knowledge. Then why would you call that certainty? It's just knowledge, then, right? It's a euphemism, or it's a synonym for that term, knowledge. So if it's certain, it has to be a particular level of particular glorified kind of knowledge, and then it has to be upgraded somehow. And what would that be? If I know something while I'm having the experience of it, then for it to be certain, I will also have to know it even when I don't experience it. That's ridiculous, right? I will have to have empiricism in order to have knowledge. And if I don't have empiricism, which I can't have if I'm not experiencing it, but can I have knowledge of it then, right? Then I can absolutely not be certain about it, right? So certainty is impossible, and it's also a violation of the idea of a future, because if it's certain, it cannot change in the next moment, so to say, right? But how could I possibly predict the future, right? Because future is an imagination. It's not about the thing, right? Or the particular object. So if we're going for some kind of certainty here, then I'm not sure he does, right? But he appeals to something. He wants to be very, very sharp on this, right? So, okay.
Since it appears that the transition from an impression present to the memory or senses to the idea of an object which we call cause or effect is founded on past experience and on our remembrance of their constant conjunction, the next question is whether experience produces the idea by means of the understanding or imagination, whether we are determined by reason to make the transition or by a certain association and relation of perceptions. If reason determined us, it would proceed upon that principle that instances of which we have had no experience must resemble those of which we have had experience, and that the course of nature continues always uniformly the same. In order, therefore, to clear up this matter, let us consider all the arguments upon which such a proposition may be supposed to be founded. And as these must be derived either from knowledge or probability, let us cast our eye on each of these degrees of evidence and see whether they afford any just conclusion of this nature. Our foregoing method of reasoning will easily convince us that there can be no demonstrative arguments to prove.
Get to the freaking point, man. And don't tell me before you prove it that you think it's going to prove it, right? You're trying to, sweeten the well here, right? You're trying to groom me into making sure I get on the right side, right?
That those instances of which we have had no experience resemble those of which we have had experience. We can at least conceive a change in the course of nature, which sufficiently proves that such a change is not absolutely impossible. To form a clear idea of anything is an undeniable argument for its possibility, and is alone a refutation of any pretended demonstration against it.
Okay, so if you can have an idea of something, be it can be an existence. It cannot be refuted. So if you can idealize it, maybe not the right term, but let's roll with it. It can't be refuted. So that maybe I'm hearing it wrong, but he's appealing to ideas being kind of flexible, maybe in the sort of framing that I put forth about Hume, that complex ideas put together of simple ideas can be imagined, which you haven't had prior experience of, like a 12-legged polar bear, right? But that, in his idea, that means it could exist. No, it doesn't mean that it could exist, but you would be able to create an idea of it if you had the impression. So maybe I'm rolling too far here. I don't know. I'm quite confused about. I mean, I feel like he's not getting to the point here. I don't know why it takes him so long.
Probability, as it discovers not the relations of ideas considered as such, but only those of objects, must in some respects be founded on the impressions of our memory and senses, and in some respects on our ideas. Were there no mixture of any impression in our probable reasonings, the conclusion would be entirely chimerical. And were there no mixture of ideas, the action of the mind in observing the relation would, properly speaking, be sensation, not reasoning. It is therefore necessary that in all probable reasonings there be something present to the mind, either seen or remembered, and that from this we infer something connected with it, which is not seen nor remembered.
Yeah, we are trying to give a meaning to certain patterns in experience or from memory or something like that. Some parts of our experience there's something to it that we sort of, what's that? That's interesting. Let me give that a name. Let me call that causation, right? I don't think, as I said before, it isn't much more, you know, complicated than that. I think there's a tendency for philosophers to complicate things sometimes way beyond what is needed. Um, and I think it's, as I said before, it stems from this fetish of thinking you have to argue from some ground floor everything. No, you don't have to, only as far as you can. But you have to stop and say, okay, from this point, I can't argue my way further. And that's when I bring in my axioms, right? In order to get to the next step, if I feel I need to get to that next step, or whatever it is, right? Um, and oftentimes you just get lost in words, and as I do here, sort of, yeah, I think it's something like this, something, whatever. It has to be shorter. It has to be more precise. It has to be more concise. It cannot be polemic like this. It has to be better, right? It has to be shorter and precise, more precise, because I will have to deduce that you're not really on board with what you're doing. You are fumbling in the dark to try to find a keyhole somewhere, right?
The only connection or relation of objects which can lead us beyond the immediate impressions of our memory and senses is that of cause and effect, and that because it is the only one on which we can found a just inference from one object to another. The idea of cause and effect is derived from experience, which informs us that such particular objects, in all past instances, have been constantly conjoined with each other. And as an object similar to one of these is
Well, it can't be an idea. Aren't you violating the idea in this case here, right? If it's an idea, there must be an impression. But you're not impressing causation, right? It doesn't have a color or a sound or a taste, right? So it can't be an idea of cause and effects. And now you are violating the term idea, I think, here. And I don't understand this. I find it strange, to be honest, right? I think he's losing his grip here.
supposed to be immediately present in its impression, we thence presume on the existence of one similar to its usual attendant. According to this account of things, which is, I think, in every point unquestionable, probability is founded on the presumption of a resemblance betwixt those objects of which we have had experience and those of which we have had none. And therefore, it is impossible this presumption can arise from probability. The same principle cannot be both the cause and effect of another. And this is, perhaps, the only proposition concerning that relation which is either intuitively or demonstratively certain. Should any one think to elude this argument, and without determining whether our reasoning on this subject be derived from demonstration or probability, pretend that all conclusions from causes and effects are built on solid reasoning, I can only desire that this reasoning may be produced in order to be exposed to our examination. It may, perhaps, be said that after experience of the constant conjunction of certain objects, we reason in the following manner. Such an object is always found to produce another. It is impossible it could have this effect if it was not endowed with a power of production. The power necessarily implies the effect, and therefore there is a just foundation for drawing a conclusion from the existence of one object to that of its usual attendant. The past production implies a power. The power implies a new production, and the new production is what we infer from the power and the past production. It were easy for me to shew the weakness of this reasoning, were I willing to make use of those observations I have already made, that the idea of production is the same with that of causation, and that no existence certainly and demonstratively.
No, but I think he wants to think of it as the object that he experienced just now, which was responsible for that object I'm experiencing now for being there. But that which you're comparing it to is that prior memory. And then it means you're comparing a memory to an impression. That's the problem. You can't say a memory is responsible for something going on now, right? Or a placement now, because a going on is actually the same thing, right? The going on is going from stretching back from a just prior memory to the now, and the now moves in some way or another. You could sort of metaphorically moves to the next step, to the next step, and the next step, sort of in sort of mental representation, right? So you're constantly comparing this now to what came just before in your memory, and I'm saying from my memory, I'm creating this story of motion, for instance, as he referred to, right? But the motion isn't there, right? It's a comparison between your memory and the sort of inner movie almost, right? Where you have this idea of the movie. You can almost, if you see a ball falling, it's almost like you can envision the whole, parabola, whatever it is, from the ball falling, right? As an inner representation of your memory of what was going on just before. But you only have that snapshot in the now. And if you want to point to some kind of empiricism regarding causation, you can never get to it, because that's not what you're doing when you're referring to causation. You're referring to your memories, right? So I don't think it's more complicated than that. But his confusion about the inside and the outside and where it's drawing things from, and his fetish with his impression and idea dichotomy is confusing this argumentation so much that I don't find it to be sufficiently valid.
Implies a power in any other object, or were it proper to anticipate what I shall have occasion to remark afterwards concerning the idea we form of power and efficacy. But as such a method of proceeding may seem either to weaken my system by resting one part of it on another, or to breed a confusion in my reasoning, I shall endeavor to maintain my present assertion without any such assistance. It shall therefore be allowed for a moment that the production of one object by another in any one instance implies a power, and that this power is connected with its effect. But it having been already proved that the power lies,
I am kind of you could probably use the rest of your life trying to decipher Hume's philosophy regarding cause and effect or causality. It's really cumbersome, right? It's really hardcore cumbersome. I mean, I don't blame people who if the rumor got around that this guy was very polemic, right? At least to some, usually, these old philosophers of old were this way, right? Immanuel Kant and Hegel, and so they were caught up in their own mental conundrums, they were right. So
is not in
and Hume is probably on the light side of things here in this context.
in the sensible qualities of the cause, and there being nothing but the sensible qualities present to us, I ask why in other instances you presume that the same power still exists merely upon the appearance of these qualities. Your appeal to past experience decides nothing in the present case, and at the utmost can only prove that that very object which produced any other was at that very instant endowed with such a power, but can never prove that the same power must continue in the same object or collection of sensible qualities, much less that a like power is always conjoined with like sensible qualities. Should it be said that we have experienced that the same power continues united with the same object, and that like objects are endowed with like powers, I would renew my question: why, from this experience, we form any conclusion beyond those past instances of which we have had experience? If you answer this question in the same manner as the preceding, your answer gives still occasion to a new question of the same kind, even in infinitum, which clearly proves that the foregoing reasoning had no just foundation.
Okay, so we matched this part here. I'll take a step back because in other instances you presume that the same power still exists merely upon the appearance of these qualities. Your appeal to past experience is memory. That's another way of saying memory, right? Past experience is memory. Decides nothing in the present case. No, it doesn't. That's sort of along the same lines as I presented my thinking here, right? It doesn't say, but it doesn't rule it out either. It's not given that because you experienced something in the past, something must happen now or in the future, right? Or in the now or in the very, very near future, right? If you call that the now. It's a situation. It's a sort of extension of the now. That something is going to be the case now or in the future. Of course not. It would be ridiculous to claim that it must happen. But you cannot say just because you cannot say it must happen doesn't mean that it won't happen. You have to say, I don't the fuck know, man, right? That's one of the most important conclusions in philosophy, is to say, I don't know, right? Go read some Plato, Socrates, right? Learn to say, I don't know, when you need to, right? But it doesn't mean that you can go with it. Just because I don't know whether or not there will be ice cream in my local, discount store, what's it called, right? The grocery store. Doesn't mean that I can take the chance that I'm going to find ice cream in that store. I don't know it, right? But I expect it to be, I'm going with it. I'm running with it. Nobody's going to stop me, right? So it's this fetish with certainty. Be careful with that, because it's a pipe dream, right? You have to be able to leave people to say, I am willing to take the chance that there's some causal connection, or whatever term you want to use for it, right? I'm not saying that it is there, but I am taking the chance that my memory is useful for doing this thing that I call causation, right? Okay, let's jump ahead here too.
Thus, not only our reason fails us in the discovery of the ultimate connection of causes and effects, but even after experience has informed us of their constant conjunction, it is impossible for us to satisfy ourselves by our reason why we should extend that experience beyond those particular instances which have fallen under our observation. We suppose, but are never able to prove, that there must be a resemblance betwixt those objects of which we have had experience and those which lie beyond the reach of our discovery. We have already taken notice of certain relations which make us pass from one object to another, even though there be no reason to determine us to that transition. And this we may establish for a general rule, that wherever the mind constantly and uniformly makes a transition without any reason, it is influenced by these relations. Now, this is exactly the present case. Reason can never shew us the connection of one object with another, though aided by experience and the observation of their constant conjunction in all past instances. When the mind, therefore, passes from the idea or impression of one object to the idea or belief of another, it is not determined by reason, but by certain principles which associate together the ideas of these objects and unite them in the imagination. Had ideas no more union in the fancy than objects seem to have to the understanding?
I think it sounds to me, maybe I'm hearing what I want to hear. It sounds to me like it's along the lines what I presented in a prior part in this series about my understanding of my approach to causality, right? It sounds like it's not something we experience, it's something that is already there in we associate with particular formations in our memory that we say, there's a principle there going on, because, or a pattern, as I called it before, right? I think we are sort of on the same page, me and Hume here. It's just a very convoluted and polemic way of presenting it, I would say, right? And by I was also say, the fancy, is that an old word for fantasy? Is that if when you fancy something, is you fantasize it or you make it up or something like that? I'm not sure that how the term fancy should be understood.
Understanding, we could never draw any inference from causes to effects, nor repose belief in any matter of fact. The inference, therefore, depends solely on the union of ideas. The principles of union among ideas I have reduced to three general ones, and have asserted that the idea or impression of any object naturally introduces the idea of any other object that is resembling, contiguous to, or connected with it. These principles I allow to be neither the infallible nor the sole causes of an union among ideas. They are not the infallible causes, for one may fix his attention during some time on any one object without looking farther. They are not the sole causes, for the thought has evidently a very irregular motion in running along its objects, and may leap from the heavens to the earth, from one end of the creation to the other, without any certain method or order. But though I allow this weakness in these three relations, and this
Creation, yeah, creation. Is this where Darwin sort of was inspired? I read something that Darwin was also not only was Einstein inspired, but Darwin considered this an inspiration for his creation theory. So who knows?
irregularity in the imagination,
If you know anything about these, I find it interesting that both Darwin and Kant and Einstein were sort of inspired by Hume here, right? It says a lot about how influential this piece of work is. So if I'm critical, it's from my own stance here. That doesn't mean that that there's nothing to gain from this book. Absolutely not. I just have my critique points, right? But I also, whenever I find reason to give him kudos for what he's writing and his abilities to reason and be skeptical and so on, of course I'll give him that, right?
yet I assert that the only general principles which associate ideas are resemblance, contiguity, and causation. There is indeed a principle of union among ideas which at first sight may be esteemed different from any of these, but will be found at the bottom to depend on the same origin. When every individual of any species of objects is found by experience to be constantly united with an individual of another species, the appearance of any new individual of either species naturally conveys the thought to its usual attendant. Thus, because such a particular idea is commonly annexed to such a particular word, nothing is required but the hearing of that word to produce the correspondent idea. And it will scarce be possible for the mind, by its utmost efforts, to prevent that transition. In this case, it is not absolutely necessary that upon hearing such a particular sound, we should reflect on any past experience and consider what idea has been usually connected with the sound. The imagination of itself supplies the place of this reflection and is so accustomed to pass from the word to the idea that it interposes not a moment's delay betwixt the hearing of the one and the conception of the other. But though I acknowledge this to be a true principle of association among ideas, I assert it to be the very same with that betwixt the ideas of cause and effects, and to be an essential part in all our reasonings from that relation. We have no other notion of cause and effect, but that of certain objects which have been always conjoined together, and which in all past instances have been found inseparable. We cannot penetrate into the reason of the conjunction. We only observe the thing itself, and always find that from the constant conjunction the objects acquire an union in the imagination. When the impression of one becomes present to us, we immediately form an idea of its usual attendant, and consequently we may establish this as one part of the definition of an opinion or belief, that it is an idea related to or associated with a present impression. Thus, though causation be a philosophical relation as implying contiguity, succession, and constant conjunction, yet it is only so far as it is a natural relation and produces an union among our ideas that we are able to reason upon it or draw any inference from it. End of file 21.
Okay, so that's this bit of the treatise. Hang on. The next one, of the nature of the idea or belief. Okay, so it seems like he's sort of venturing a bit away from causality here. I'm not sure how to approach this philosophy. It seems fluffy to me, right? That's the best term I can use at the moment. Generally understand that Hume, in a very short way, says you cannot get to a causality in the scientific or experiential manner we are usually accustomed to, for instance, having an idea of an apple or, emotion or something like that. But it stems from the idea, if I want this, this notebook or this MacBook to close, I'm not going to sit here and wait for it to close, right? And I can say close, and I might have an idea of that causality. No, I have an idea that there are particular things I need to do. I need to take my hand, I need to raise it up here, put it here, and push it, and so on, right? And now I'm opening it again. Otherwise, it won't happen. So causation is important in particular when I need to be a part of it, that causal chain, right? And I have an idea, when I did that the last time, that happened, and I liked it that it happened. So if I want that to happen again, I need to inflict myself on a particular similar situation in order to get that result, right? That's why it's important to have this idea of causality, right? That you can use it to your benefit, right? I'm not saying that it's something that is there. I constantly pound on that. But your notion of working from that principle, to use Hume's term principle, right, is that it might work, right? It's your best shot, right? It's the only shot possibly, right? I mean, if I want to eat, I probably should go to my fridge and check whether or not I still have those, whatever, cucumbers, whatever I have in my fridge, right? And shove it in my face, right? That's causality, right? It's not very complicated. It's when you need to either make or refute a scientific approach to it that it might become polemic, like Hume has made it here, in my opinion, right? Okay, maybe I'm just very good at keeping things concise and precise and simple, but it feels quite fluffy what we are, and I'm not sure. Are we venturing away from causality now, or that's when we affirm that God is existent or whatever? Yeah, okay, of the nature of idea or belief. So now we are going into sort of coming up with shit and God and religion. So it doesn't sound like causation, but I'm not sure. Well, maybe we'll see when we get to the next chapter in the next part of my series here. And thank you for stopping by. I hope you enjoyed and was inspired, at least in some aspect or another. And shall like and subscribe, as I usually say, and consider a donation. Join the board, links below. And otherwise, see you in the next one.